Welcome back to the Conclusion of the Matter podcast. This is Ryan Weaver, and with me today are Robbie Santiago, Ren Ferguson, starting at center. Just the best. It's NCAA time. Just
okay. He's taller.
Yeah, I'm starting at guard. Robbie's forward, and you're starting at center.
I will not be a center in my lifetime.
I'll never be a forward.
I don't think I'm tall enough to be a center.
Out of us three, you are.
Well, out of the three of us, yeah, but
that's
not
all we
like
got,
actually
buddy.
in basketball.
I mean, literally, our team is us. But anyway, I digress. Already.
Well, what about Jesus?
Anyway, what's that?
I said, what about Jesus? Isn't he on our team?
Yeah, but he's like he can play the 1 through 5. I mean,
Yeah.
anyway.
We can just sit on the bench.
Good point. Anyway, this guy.
So technicalities. You try to make one joke.
I know, and he's like,
not so fast.
Jesus is on our team.
But see, that's what's funny to me.
Yeah. Do you have your big word ready to go this week?
I've got a few in the chamber. I'll just see if they come up.
Well, again, welcome back. We're glad you're listening, checking in. We got some fan mail that we read, so we really appreciate that.
Yeah. That was very nice.
Yeah, very nice to send that in to us. We appreciate that. But as Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. And as we've said before, we try to take topics and or just textual looks at things in the Bible and use the Bible to get our answers rather than what we think is the right thing to do. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Ren, and he can introduce us to today's topic.
Yes. Well, again, glad that everybody's here. If you've read the title of this episode, you probably already kind of know what we're going to be talking about, but we're returning to one of the segments that I believe we started. It was last season, right?
I think so.
It's kind of a newer segment called Know Your History. And what the plan is with this is we will periodically return to this segment and kind of follow the history of Scripture to the best of our ability, doing so chronologically. And then possibly, if we get all the way through everything, which this might take us about 5 years to do, we might
on Revelation, yes,
we might get into some, I guess, like post-apostolic church history type of thing that I think would be really interesting to study. I think that's something that doesn't really get studied that much. Not that it's 100% necessary, I don't guess, but it's very useful.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think it benefits because you can see what they did
and
so
you can
close
see,
to
like,
the church.
common beliefs.
Yeah, exactly.
Like with Justin Martyr, who lived in the mid-2nd century, so just like 60, 70 years after the New Testament was ended. I mean, he talks about like weekly observance of the Lord's Supper and different things like that. So you do get a glimpse of how the church worshipped and how they worked even after the apostles. So it's interesting. It's very interesting. But we're not quite there yet. We are going to be looking at the book of Judges, and we decided this is probably going to be a two-parter for this episode. And the book of Judges really, and we'll just kind of go through the chapters. As always with these things, it's going to be kind of high level, just to kind of get, again, the chronology of things, kind of map it out in our minds. I think it's very helpful to do that. And so as we start to look at the beginning of Judges, it does kind of pick up after the death of Joshua there in verse 1. That's going to be the first thing that you read about. And the first chapter mainly deals with the continuing conquest of the land of Canaan after Joshua has passed away, and some of the things that they did and some of the people that they had conquered. But I think the main takeaway, especially from the first two chapters, is what you see on a number of occasions throughout these two chapters. Starting in verse 27, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Iblim and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in the land. And when Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not drive them out completely. Now, he says the same thing in different ways in discussing different specific groups of people. But that's kind of the crux of the matter here with the first couple of chapters is, yes, after Joshua died, they continued to conquest, but they did not drive, as he's pointing out there, all of the people out of the land of Canaan, which Joshua warned them about in Joshua chapter 23, and I believe it's in verses 12 and 13 there. He says, "For if you turn back and cling to the remnant of these nations remaining among you and make marriages with them so that you associate with them and they with you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you, but they shall be a snare and a trap for you, a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good ground that the Lord your God has given you." And even Moses gave similar warnings. I have a couple of references here, Exodus 23, verses 32 through 34, and Numbers 33 and verse 55, where that warning was made. It says, okay, yes, you're going to go in, you can conquer, and you need to drive out all of these people, totally get them out of the land. And if you don't, it's going to cause problems for you in the future. And that's what we see happening, again, especially in these first couple of chapters of Judges.
But even the whole book, I mean, how many times, well, not only that, but how many times do they kind of distance themselves from worshiping and staying loyal to God and the idolatry, but also kind of what you had mentioned, Ren, the intermingling, all of those things get into trouble because a lot of times what happens when either of those things happen, one or both, is they start turning to idolatry and worshiping, Baal and the gods of the Syrians and some of the other, polytheistic gods at the time. And so they're distancing themselves from God. And then you'll kind of see a pattern throughout the book is that they'll do evil in the sight of God, and then they'll kind of, feel remorseful for whatever reason, sometimes due to their circumstance more than more than altruistic reasons. But then they'll cry out to God and God will send them a judge to kind of help them out of their certain predicament, many of these that we'll talk about. And then a little bit of time will pass where there will be relative peace. They'll be loyal to God, and then they'll mess up again and fall back into temptation and start doing evil again. And then the cycle just kind of repeats where they turn back to idolatry and start messing up again. They get into bad circumstances. They cry out again, make kind of a new, not covenant, but new kind of agreement, I guess, if you will.
What I find interesting there is they not only didn't drive them out, but they turned them into slaves or task workers.
Yep.
And what's interesting is they were in that situation themselves. Well, not necessarily these folks, but their
fathers.
Their not descendants. What's the
ancestors?
Ancestors. That's the other way you go. Their ancestors, and so they're very well aware of this and how. I don't think that was enjoyed, but also it reminds me of Saul when he was supposed to utterly destroy the Amalekites, and the people say, "Well, why don't we just save the best and use it for sacrifice?" It's kind of like, well, we know what we were told, but we can keep these people and they can do all of our work for us. It's like maybe they had that thought process as like, oh, well, we know,
like it justifies it.
Yeah, justified it a little. Yeah, I don't know. It just.
Yeah, and that very well could be the case. And
I just thought they might have known better, but anyway.
Well, and I'm trying to remember, you saying that reminded me, I believe there's a passage where God deals, and I don't remember exactly what the context is or exactly what the commandment is. I want to say it's in the book of Leviticus, where it's one of the passages dealing with slaves. But basically the general point of it is, I can't remember the specific points of it. The general point was to basically not treat their slaves the way that they were treated in Egypt because they had suffered all of that. They needed to be better.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting you bring that point up is they did kind of revert back to that, it seems like. But the cycle that Robbie was bringing up is actually described in chapter 2, starting around verse 16, going down through around verse 21 or 22 there. That cycle of them being faithful to God, falling into idolatry, God sending the judge delivering them becoming faithful to God again, the judge dying, and then them becoming unfaithful again. One of the key verses I would say in Judges chapter 2 is verse 10. It's a very well-known verse from this chapter. It says, "All that generation and all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. And right there, I mean, you put that together with the fact that they weren't driving the people out of the land of Canaan, that's
Asking
the
for
problem.
trouble.
Yes. They didn't fully drive the people out, and then they didn't teach their children. And that's why all of this continues to happen.
And I think that's, I mean, you probably heard it said before. I've heard it said apostasy is just one generation
Yeah.
away. It doesn't take, hundreds of years to
Yeah.
do it. I mean, it can happen. Like if we would literally quit teaching the children here at Collinsville, once we're all dead and gone, unless other people move in, I mean, that's why it's important.
I think it's an important reminder for us too that, it was true for them. It can also be true for us that, like you had mentioned, we can be one generation away. And, but another verse kind of, Ren, you kind of mentioned this. There may be people that listen to this podcast who don't know what a judge actually is. And it kind of explains that in verse 18 that he says, and when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was the judge and delivered them out of the hand of the enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed them and harassed them. And it came to pass when the judge was dead that they reverted and behaved more corruptly than their fathers by allowing other gods to serve them and to bow down to them. They did not cease from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. So it kind of reiterates kind of what we read about earlier in verse 10 about them, but kind of goes a step further to kind of explain the cycle that they were continuously in chapters 1 and 2, but also for the remainder that we'll see in the book of Judges as well. And a judge in particular is just, some not necessarily like a king or a ruler per se, but this just somebody who's going to kind of like deliver them from that oppression, somebody that has God's support. Again, not as like a court judge or as a king or a secular leader per se. Many of them have kind of militaristic leadership skills, I guess you could make the argument for, but they're not like an established political leader of any kind.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of goes back to God's, at least his original desire for the people of Israel is that they wouldn't have a king and he would just be their ruler. But he knew, even as he spoke through Moses, the day was coming that they were going to want a king and he would allow them to have that king. One other thing on chapter 2, unless you'll have something else with chapter 2 before we move on.
I had a couple things from chapter 1 that stood out, just kind of like odd tidbits that made me go like, But when in verse, where is it here? We're introduced to I think it's one of the Perizzite kings named Bezek. I'm probably mispronouncing that. And he was kind of one of the Canaanite or the Perizzite leaders, and this was one of the groups that they battled against. They battled numerous groups in chapters 1 and 2 and throughout the whole book of Judges. But it says at the end of verse 6, I don't know why this was just kind of an odd story. It says, and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to gather scraps under my table as I have done, and so God repaid me. And so I think that it's just brought up just because this person was notorious for doing that.
Yeah.
And then, kind of an example of karma here, not literally, but just as a figure of speech. But this same thing
Christian
happens to him.
podcast, Robbie.
Next week, we'll talk about how karma does not exist.
Yes. But not literal karma, but kind of similar to like Haman in the book of Esther, just like the very thing.
Irony?
Yeah, maybe that's a better word
the
than
humor of God, maybe.
Yeah.
And then another name that I don't know if we'll bring up later, a little bit later in the chapter in verse 12. Caleb, I think we probably mentioned when we talked about Joshua in our podcast last year, but he was one of the faithful of the 12 spies that came back. It says in verse 12, then Caleb said, whoever attacks Kirjath Sepher and takes it, to him I will give my daughter Ashesh as my wife. And Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it, so he gave him his daughter as his wife. And so an odd interchange here. I wasn't bringing it up for that sake. But Othniel's Caleb's brother, he's also going to be brought up again later in the book of Judges here as well. So we'll get to him here soon. But that's all I had on really both of those chapters, except at the end of 2, that God, we've kind of mentioned this, but not directly, that God's going to, since Israel didn't wipe out all of these, he's going to be like, well, you guys are just, kind of going to play games instead of following my commandments. He's going to allow a lot of their enemies to kind of stick around, groups like the Canaanites, the
That's
Hittites.
what I was going to point out there in verse 21. He says, I will no longer drive them out. I'm going to teach them a lesson. Verse 22, the purpose was to test them and to see if they would turn back. You kind of mentioned the cycle both of you had, and Robbie, you were there in 18. And 19, what caught me is they were more corrupt than their fathers. So it's not only the cycle, but it seems like it gets worse.
Yeah. I was just going to point out, just for sake of clarification, looking at verses 6 through 10. In verse 6, it talks about when Joshua dismissed the people. If you're just reading this through, that might seem kind of confusing, considering that verse 1 and chapter 1 and verse 1 starts with his death. It's not written chronologically here. This goes back to Joshua, I believe 23 and 24 is when Joshua's giving his farewell address. And so just if that kind of confuses you when you're reading through.
Good call out.
Anything else there with chapter 2? All right, so chapter 3 is when we actually start getting into the judges. And I believe we have, is it 3 different judges? Yes. 3 judges here in chapter 3. And it starts with the one. Now, obviously, the first part of this, again, is some more narrative along the same lines of what we were just talking about, all of the nations that God left in the land of Canaan. We do see, I'll just read verses 5 and 6. It says, so the people of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. All of the people that they were supposed to totally drive out of the land. And their daughters they took to themselves for wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they served their gods, which again was something that was forbidden by God to do, on top of driving them out of the land to begin with. And so we see there in verse 7 the natural result of that. The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asheroth. And so Mesopotamia is the kingdom or the group of people that rose up against Israel. And we see at the end of verse 8 that Israel served Mesopotamia for 8 years. It was interesting to me. I had never really paid attention to this before, but it's interesting. I think as we go through this, the time that they serve their oppressors seems to always get longer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's interesting. It was just kind of interesting to me. But it starts out a relatively short period of time.
Maybe
this
it's
first
because
time
they continued to get
progressively
corrupt,
worse. Yeah. So they serve Mesopotamia for 8 years, and then Othniel is the one that's raised up, which Robbie already brought up there at the end of verse 9. We see that he's Caleb's younger brother, and he judged Israel. And so he went to war in verse 10 with the Mesopotamians, and he prevailed over them. But what's also interesting is even though they did depart often, and I don't think this is universally true, but a lot of times they had peace for longer than they were oppressed. And that's especially true in this case. They were oppressed for 8 years, but then they had rest in verse 11
I think
for 40 years.
he did win, but it's because the Lord
Yes.
gave Cushan Rishahashaim.
Yeah.
However you want to say.
Don't look at me. I mispronounce things.
Anyway, I just wanted to say that.
Yes,
name, but go
and
ahead.
that's a good point, and I think that's something we see throughout.
Yes,
with
yeah.
all of these judges, it was ultimately even as Robbie already pointed out, going back to chapter 2. What verse was it? In verse 18, whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and He saved them from the hands of their enemies. So. We see that all throughout this. So that's the first judge. In the book of Judges itself, I believe there's only 12 judges that are recorded. Samuel is generally considered a judge, but we won't get to him in these episodes.
There's also a theory that he wrote this, but we don't know.
Yeah.
And
Anyway.
I was just going to also briefly explain, even I don't know if we touched on this any with Joshua. I don't think that we did, but that Mesopotamia area, kind of in the Middle East, you had this area called the Fertile Crescent, which ran pretty much from the Persian Gulf through, I think is the Adriatic Sea, but some sea, I forget. I think it might be the Adriatic, but no, the Red Sea, duh. But
Yeah.
anyway, it's called the Fertile Crescent, obviously, because of the farmland there. Mesopotamia was, generally speaking, like the eastern half of that. May have learned this in school, but you had two major rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and that land between those two rivers, current day like Iraq-ish, would have been Mesopotamia. So it's kind of the eastern part of that.
Iraq-ish. I like that.
Iraq-ish. Well, gotta give like a relative location. That's another geography word there. But Mesopotamia, even you have a lot of groups. Canaan would have been a little bit further west of Mesopotamia, and each of these groups that we talk about, we could spend, an inordinate amount of time explaining where each of these are. But Mesopotamia is kind of a pretty well-known one. And even within Mesopotamia, you had kingdoms such as Babylon and Sumer, Akkad, so other places that are mentioned, not necessarily in Judges, but in other parts of the Bible or just in secular history. Like Babylon was where like Hammurabi's code was from. And it's slightly different when we read about Nebuchadnezzar later in the Bible. He is technically considered Babylonian, but it's more the Chaldeans. So they're kind of two different groups, even though they're geographically pretty close.
And those terms are sometimes used interchangeably.
Synonymously. Yeah, exactly. Like the Babylonians.
Yeah.
Even though generally when the Bible's referring to them, it's not talking about the Babylonians of Hammurabi. It's talking about the ones of, Nebuchadnezzar, and I think Nimrod, one of my favorite kingdoms, has a different connotative meaning now than it did then.
Yes.
But
all right.
But anyway, I just wanted to throw a little bit of background about Mesopotamia. I'll probably think of the specific body of water like some other time.
Yeah.
But anyway, you can go on.
All right.
But definitely the Persian Gulf.
Okay, so starting there in verse 12, we read of the second judge, who was a man by the name of Ehud, and he, of course, was used to, liberate the people from Eglon, king of Moab. We see that in verse 12. And we see in verse 14, the people of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moabites, 18 years. So again, we start already kind of seeing an increase in time here. And I'll start reading in verse 15. It says, Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. Now that's crucial to the rest of the story. The people of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. And Ehud made for himself a sword with two edges, a cubit in length, so about 18 inches, and he bound it on his right thigh under his clothes. And he presented a tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. How would you like to be remembered in the scriptures as a very fat man? Anyways, in verse 18, it says, And when Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who carried the tribute, but he himself turned back at the idols near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he commanded silence, and all his attendants went out from his presence. And Ehud came to him as he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. And Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And he arose from his seat. And Ehud reached to his left hand, with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly, until the hilt went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not pull the sword out of his belly. And the
He was so fat, he just put it in there. He's like,
it's just stuck. It's stuck. Yeah.
That's a lost cause.
It is. And so here we have this judge, assassinating the king on behalf of God and to liberate God's people. Now, obviously, there's some more details given in this narrative and what Ehud goes on to do and how they fight the Moabites, the children of Israel fight the Moabites. We see in verse 29 that at that time they killed 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men, not able to escape. But then in verse 30, you see that other side of this. They had rest for 80 years. So they were oppressed for 18, but then they had rest for 80 after God delivered them through Ehud.
What one thing in there, all the way back in verse 12, is the only reason Eglon, the king of Moab, was able to conquer Israel was because it said the Lord strengthened him.
Yeah.
Because it was punishment because, as you
Yeah.
see there, they went back to doing evil.
Yeah.
So this follows the same pattern we see where God establishes kingdoms.
Yep.
He used Babylon to punish Israelites. He's
Yeah.
using Moab here to punish.
Yeah.
So it's not that God's always in control.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. I was going to bring up that word tribute there. Tribute was something that, especially as it related to like ancient China, but also a lot of these like Asian nations, it would just kind of be a gift of some kind that generally would be something from your nation that you would give to another country to kind of show like honor and respect or kind of be accepted by them. Generally speaking, especially as it related to China, it would be given to a more powerful nation to kind of like accept the sovereignty of your nation in a lot of cases. So obviously this was kind of, a sign of them being accepted, but I don't know that it would necessarily indicate that that Israel was seen as an inferior nation to Moab at the time. But since they had been not in captivity but enslaved for that period of time, maybe they were considered that.
Yeah.
And it mentions that Ehud was left-handed. So which he also brings up later in Judges. I had it written down somewhere, but I can't remember off the top of my head which one it was. But I just thought that was a unique thing to bring up.
Yeah.
I forget what percentage of the world's left-handed. I think it's like 5 or 10%, I think. Lucas, we don't know which one he's going to be. They say it's 50. You have 50% chance to be left-handed if both your parents are left-handed, which Allison and I are. So,
And I think part of that goes back to maybe some of their customs whenever they were like checking people for armor or swords or weapons or something. They kind of make the assumption that everybody's right-handed. And so in that case, you would check the left thigh. And so it's possible that they overlooked the right thigh because they didn't know he was left-handed. Yeah,
exactly.
Anything else on that?
Nope.
I don't think so. The body of water was actually, I feel really dumb about this, but I think it was actually the Mediterranean Sea.
Yeah.
I should have remembered that. Now, if you factor in Egypt, Upper and Lower Egypt, then it would consider
be
the Red Sea.
Yeah.
But sometimes Egypt's thrown in with those, and sometimes they're not. It just kind of depends.
Now, does it? No, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't have touched the south of the Black Sea, because that's on the north end of Asia Minor, right?
Yeah, it would have been. Yeah, that would have been on the other side of Turkey. So
Yeah.
the Fertile Crescent and Mesopotamia, neither of those would have contained it. Mesopotamia was kind of like just the eastern part of the whole Fertile Crescent.
Shamgar.
Shamgar. He gets a whole verse.
Nice.
And it's interesting. I mean, we don't really have anything about this. We don't know if like the Philistines were actually oppressing or if they had just kind of risen up against the people. There's not a whole lot of information, or if this is just like a single conflict where God delivers them out of. And that's why sometimes people kind of debate whether or not Shamgar should be included as a judge or not. I mean, I'll throw him in there because I don't know.
He's got his own heading.
I mean, yeah. But it seems like he served the purpose that the others did.
And so he defended them against the Philistines with an ox goad. He killed 600 men. It's kind of reminiscent of a later judge named Samson. He did it with a donkey's jawbone, though, and killed a lot more people. We're going to get to it. He was a wild dude. Wild dude.
But yet he's still mentioned in Hebrews 11.
Yes, he is.
He is.
All right, so chapter... go ahead.
I was just going to bring up the ox goad because I didn't know what in the world that was.
Yeah.
And so I looked it up, and it's basically like a big rod that they would use to get an ox to keep going.
Goad 'em,
Yeah. I always kind of think of like a fire
prod.
stoker or something.
Yeah,
just
like
like
fire
a,
poker.
something to
I think
poke
of
'em
the
with.
electric cattle prods that they obviously they didn't have electric ones then, but yeah, that's what I think of.
Yeah.
Essentially the same though. But for anybody like me that didn't know what a goad was until a few hours ago or whenever.
Chapter 4 and chapter 5. This is the first instance where a judge has multiple chapters given to them, and that is Deborah specifically, but also always accompanied with Barak.
I'm sorry. One more thing about Shamgar. I believe that verse is the first time that the Philistines are mentioned in the Bible too. So, just a tidbit.
Yeah.
Before we talk about Deborah.
Yeah, Deborah.
Oh, the boy.
All right, so we have Deborah and Barak. Now, this one's also interesting because she's the only
I've
female
always heard it
judge.
Barak.
Barak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's from Mortal Kombat though.
What, Barak?
Yeah, maybe that's why I think there's a guy on there, Barak.
Okay.
Anyway,
Yeah.
I don't think it's the same dude by any means.
I don't think so. I would doubt it.
Well, the judges did some. They did some.
Yeah, they did
slaying,
some crazy
so,
stuff. Yeah.
you know,
Maybe that's where they got the name from, at least.
Could be.
I don't know. So we have these two judges, and it talks about after Ehud had died in verse 1. And that, again, I guess kind of muddies the water of the chronology of this a little bit. It's possible that maybe during Shamgar's time, the people of Israel had not maybe totally fallen away, but again, just had this conflict with the Philistines. And so it was after Ehud died that they fell back into idolatry. But either way, we do see Jabin, the king of Canaan, and his commander Sisera rising up against the people and oppressing the people. And we see in verse 3 that he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. And then Deborah, a prophetess, we see in verse 4, was judging Israel at the time. And this, again, is interesting because she's the only female judge that we know of, that we have recorded. And a lot of people, especially today, like to appeal to her for what's the egalitarian view of men and women's roles within the church. That's a whole other discussion that maybe we could have some other time. But here she is. She is judging Israel. And, of course, Jabin, Canaan, Sisera are oppressing them, but she summons Barak or Barak. That does sound more exotic, I guess, in verse 6.
that's what I was going for.
Yeah. And the son of Abinoam, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, from some town that I definitely can't pronounce correctly except for the last part, which is Naphtali, or Kadesh, Naphtali. And said to him, has not the Lord and the God of Israel commanded you, go gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun. And I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him to your hand. And Barak said to her, or Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, on the road on which you are going, it will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak and to Kadesh. And so we do see, obviously, in verse 10, the 10,000 men come. Ultimately, they're able to overthrow the Canaanites. Sisera flees, and that's when we read of Jair. Jael. Yeah, Jair is another judge that comes later. Jael, he comes to her tent. She invites him in, kind of under the pretense that she's going to give him a place to rest and recover from his fleeing. She gives him something to drink. He falls asleep, and she takes a tent peg and drives it through his skull into the ground. And that goes back to what Deborah said earlier. She said to Barak, she says, I'll go with you, but in doing this, you're not going to get any glory, and God's going to give Sisera into the hands of a woman, which is what we see taking place there. And so Jabin, the king of Canaan, Sisera, they're defeated and killed. And yet again, God has delivered the people out of the hands of their oppressors. You have anything on chapter 4?
No, just two corrections. Okay. Number one, the Mortal Kombat guy is Baraka. There's an A on the end, so it's really not the same thing, but I always called him Barak. The second thing is Philistines are listed in Genesis, Exodus, and Joshua. So
okay. Well,
so this is the fourth book.
Well, Well, I read that somewhere, but they were mistaken.
Because I was like, man, I'm pretty sure I read
Yeah.
about him in Exodus, but
I thought
didn't
I
even
had
know
to, but
Genesis. But I did a quick
couldn't-
search.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, it pays to know. And
Hey.
yeah, sorry for the mistake.
It's okay. I'd
Just
rather
something I
us
read.
correct each other
You better
than some
repent.
reader get on our notes and tell us we used
Yeah.
the wrong Looney Tunes character for
Right.
what
I
Yeah,
was
maybe
wrong
they
about-
meant
yeah.
that this is the first time that they're mentioned in the book of Judges, as we'll
Oh,
see.
maybe.
That they'll be
Yeah,
mentioned
could be.
several
Could be.
other
Could be.
times, especially with Samson.
And chapter 5 is just the aftermath of this, and it's a song of Deborah and Barak as they glorify God for that deliverance and for saving them from, the Canaanites and Jabin. There's a lot of little things if you have the time to go through and study and read that. A lot of interesting points that can be brought out. But did you all have anything specifically on chapter 5?
I find interesting in the song they included the crushing of the skull. Like, we don't sing
Yeah.
songs that have that,
Yeah.
But they're obviously rehashing the story.
Yeah.
But I found that interesting. So
You have anything?
It's just like there's a big difference in songs that we, like this one that are just very graphic.
Yes.
Like even like verse 26 says, I don't know what I was trying to say there. She stretched her hand to the tent peg, her right hand to the workman's hammer. She pounded Sisera. She pierced his head. She split and struck through his temple. Like if
I mean, in
no,
verse,
I don't see
I would
myself
want to know
singing
what that
you know?
sounded like.
well, verse 27, I felt like it was a chorus because it said, between her feet he sank, he fell, he lay still. Between her feet he sank, he fell.
Yeah.
Where he
So
sank,
that's-
there he fell dead.
I was like, that is interesting. Anyway,
I'm just saying, I don't know. I'd kind of be a little squeamish singing about all
Yeah.
this. Was my
we're
only
going to skip
point.
verse 2 today because, anyway.
Okay, so chapter 6 then. This is actually chapter 6 through chapter 8 is all part of the same context there, deals with the same judge of Gideon. This is when Midian has risen up against the people and was oppressing the people of Israel now. And we see it in verse 1 of chapter 6, he gave them into the hands of Midian 7 years. So again, not quite as long as some of the other oppressions, as I pointed out. It wasn't a universal rule, but it did seem to be a general trend that they were oppressed for longer periods of time as things progressed. But then God calls Gideon, and I think his call is very interesting. And outside of Samson, we have more information about him than any other judge. Well, I guess Samuel, if you want to include him. But in the book of Judges itself, more about Gideon. And God, of course, is calling Gideon. And where is Gideon's reply? Verse 15 is interesting. He says, "Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." So he has to me, this always reminds me of Moses. He has a very similar response of Moses of like, who am I to go and to do this? And I think we see not all throughout it, but especially throughout the early parts of his time as a judge, there seems to be a lot of uncertainty on his part, and he needs a lot of reassurance from God that God's going to be with him. He's going to take care of him. But then by the end of it, especially when you get to chapter 8, there does seem to be this kind of a confidence about him, a conviction and a trust in God that God's going to take care of him. Because at the beginning of this, God tells him to go and to destroy the altars that were kind of in his town. But it says in verse 27 that because he was too afraid of his family and the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night. And at the end of chapter 6? Yeah, he has to put the fleece out 2 different times and say, if I put the fleece out and there's dew all on the grass but not on the fleece, I'll do it. And if I put the fleece out again and there's only dew on the fleece but not on the grass, okay, then I'll have confidence to go and
He
do what you're
seems to
telling me
have
to
some
do.
like hesitancy.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, it's interesting that he, as part of that, he's like, okay, I want to try this 2 different ways
Yeah.
just to make sure.
Yeah.
But he pleads with God, don't let your anger burn against me.
Yeah.
And it shows me the patience of God that sometimes we say that how could people question God? But
Yeah.
to your point, Moses needed signs. People needed signs. And this is just, I think, the human side of a man that's like, okay, yeah, you did this one thing. Can we do it this other way just to prove it wasn't a fluke?
Yeah.
And, you know, we're hard on people sometimes, but I think we can be the same way. But
I agree.
I think Moses is a good comp, though. But ironically, if you back up to verse 12, you see God's explanation, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor." Which we'll see that that quote was also used in Joshua, and it's used in other, I think, in like Ezra or Nehemiah, I think again maybe, or something like that. But definitely in other points in the book of Judges, we'll see that phrase again. But I had thought that in one of those that had come up again.
Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles.
So of course the one.
Well, that's
and then
just
it stops.
that's out. I don't know. That's out of the ESV though. I don't know about like King James.
Yeah, I might be mixing it up with Joshua, but anyway, a phrase that's pretty frequently used in the Old Testament, in the book of Judges, and in other books. But I think it was interesting that he kind of doubted himself as being young. Reminded me of Timothy about the army being weak, and I think it's ironic that he's questioning it then, but then, well, I don't want to get too far ahead, but then God's going to eventually reduce his army, and he seems to have more confidence then than he does here at the beginning of the story of Gideon here. But I think the main point in all of this is that God's with him, and so, I think that's kind of the important takeaway here is it doesn't matter, if you're an older brother or younger brother, same thing for Deborah in the previous chapter. I kind of wondered why she was chosen over like Barak, for example, or Barak, or however you say that. I can't help but think of like, even though it's spelled differently, think of Obama, but probably pronounced the same. Like you're just sitting there saying that, I'm like, I'm just keeping my mouth shut here.
I was trying to find, because there's a figure of speech, because you brought up in verse 6 how God calls Gideon a mighty man of valor. There's a figure of speech, and I can't remember what it's called. I want to say it starts with an E, but it's a figure of speech where you call something basically you describe something by what it's going to be rather than what it is presently. And so it's possible that God's employing that type of figure of speech, saying that he's going to become this mighty man of valor.
Kind of like
which
when
we
Jesus had spoken with Paul in the New Testament. Not a mighty man of valor, but kind of that. That he'll be a vessel for me kind of thing.
And so that kind of idea, which we do see that progression all through this. Y'all have anything, chapter 6? Okay.
I don't think so. We talked about him destroying his father's altar of Baal, and then the wet and dry fleece thing.
Okay, so in chapter 7 is where we see he's commanded to go and to fight against Midian, but before he does that, and perhaps, I think God is teaching Gideon to trust him because he has a decent size army, but God says in verse 2, the people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. And so he started out with 32,000 men, but we see after this first, wave of people returning, we see 22,000 people left, and so he was left with 10,000. And then God says in verse 4, there's still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, you shall go with you. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, shall not go. And long story short, in verse 6, we see that the final number of men that he ends up with is 300. And so going from 32,000 to 300.
Because they lapped up the water.
Yes.
I wonder what he's thinking.
Oh,
it's like, excuse me?
Yeah,
I was
really.
thinking 300 would leave, and
Yeah.
I'd be like,
Yeah.
but I mean, yeah, that's quite a downsizing. But
Especially since it compares the Midianites, and I think there were some Amalekites or some other group with them there too, that says they were as numerous as the locusts. And
Yeah.
then like even like it brings up camels. I don't know if that's supposed to be like a sign of like wealth or of status or what have you, but it says that was pretty much equally.
Yeah.
I think it compared it to like number of sand by the sea.
Yeah.
And so this giant, figuratively, this like ginormous and powerful, perhaps like economically powerful empire, if you will, that they're going to go to war against with 300 is just.
Yeah. Well, and in verse 10, God tells Gideon to go down to the camp of the Midianites, and he tells him, if you're afraid, take your servant Purah with you. And in verse 11, we see that Gideon went down to the camp, but he brought his servant with him. So,
So he's
what does that
afraid.
mean? He's afraid. I mean,
I think for
not to be
valid
too
reasons.
hard. Yeah. I think it is.
I'd be a little
I think I
apprehensive
would
myself.
be too. Sometimes with the fleece and everything like that, people would be very, I guess, dismissive and be like, "Oh, he should have been fine." But try to empathize with them a little bit. I think I would still be a little bit hesitant.
Hindsight's always 20.
Yeah. Were you about to say something, Ryan?
I did. Hindsight's always
Oh.
20/20.
Okay. I
That's
thought you
it.
were about to say something else.
No, I don't think so.
I wonder how powerful the Midianites would have been, like perceived to be, just
Yeah.
from military might as well.
Yeah.
I don't have the answer to that, but I would, based on how they're portrayed, it seems like they would have been considered pretty powerful for that region.
Yeah.
But just speculation.
Yeah. And so he's left with the 300 men. But he goes down to the camp and he overhears some of the soldiers there talking. And one of them says in verse 13, "Behold, I dreamed a dream, and behold, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian and came to the tent and struck it so that it fell and turned it upside down so that the tent lay flat. And his comrade answered, This is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp." And so Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation. He worshipped, and he returned to the camp of Israel and said, now this is where you start to see a little more conviction coming from Gideon. "Arise, for the Lord has given the host of Midian into your hand." And so they take the 300 men, and really throughout the remainder of the chapter, you see their destruction. And really what they do is very cunning. They go by night. They have torches. They have their trumpets. They have these jars that they smash, basically just creating chaos around the camp. And so the Midianites and the Amalekites actually end up killing each other because they're so thrown into chaos and confusion. So that's chapter 8, or chapter 7, rather. Anything on that before we go to chapter 8?
Nope.
All right, so in chapter 8, we see the pursuit of the kings of the Midianites and the Amalekites. And we do see Ephraim, they have a couple of spats with some people throughout the book of Judges, and so does Benjamin. I'm like internal, like with fellow Jews. And so Ephraim is all upset because Gideon didn't allegedly call them to come and fight the Midianites.
That's going to be their qualm. Like they're just like out of the loop, and both times and they get mad about like not being informed.
So the first part of the chapter is Gideon having to deal with them, but he tells them in verse 3, God has given into your hand the princes of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb. What have I been able to do in comparison with you? Then their anger was against him subsided when he said this. And so Gideon is pursuing the kings, and he comes to Succoth in verse 5. And he asks basically for their help as they're pursuing. And the officials of Succoth basically said, if you haven't already killed them, we're not helping you. And so Gideon then says in verse 7, I think this is another time when we see his conviction. Well then, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't have to consult God this time. He knows, okay, he's going to give the Midianite and the Amalekite kings into my hand, and then I'm coming back and I'm going to punish you too. So again, I think we see that conviction. He does something similar with Penuel, if that's how you pronounce that. And he certainly does. He captures them. He kills Zeba and Zalmunna, and then he comes back to Succoth and Penuel and punishes them as well.
Mm-hmm.
Anything on all of that so far?
Good summary.
And then there's a bit of a fault with Gideon in the last part of chapter 8 because he creates this ephod, which ultimately becomes a source of basically idol worship after he is dead. And so kind of going back to the overall narrative, they were faithful while he was living, but then after he died, they reverted back to idolatrous practices. Anything else there with chapter 8?
Had a lot of sons.
Yeah, he
70.
did. 70 sons. That's a lot of kids. Way too many.
Got one, and I'm busy enough as it is.
Yes,
So
definitely.
all things considered, 70 would be quite a few.
Yeah. Y'all want to move on to chapter 9 then?
It's fine.
Okay. So chapter 9 doesn't really deal with the judge. This is kind of, I guess, a pit stop in the narrative because you read of a man named Abimelech. And basically what he does is he rises up and he basically says, I want to be your king. I want to rule over all of you, especially his specific tribe. In verse 2, he talks about which is better for you that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal, which is another name for Gideon if you read all of this, or that one rule over you. Remember that also that I am your bone and your flesh. Now, Abimelech was one of Gideon's sons. So one of the 70 that Robbie just pointed out.
Actually, you had the 70, and also Abimelech was actually the one son of one of the concubines.
Yeah.
So he is, he's their brother, but also like
Like a
sort of-
half-brother.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess you could consider it
Yeah.
that way. So he's kind of, in a sense, somewhat of an outsider in that sense. So it's kind of ironic that he's the one that's wanting to kind of spearhead all of this
Yeah.
and kind of trick all of them. And then we kind of see that distance between the family because, what is he?
Yeah, he goes and he kills all of the other.
Once he gets Shechem's
son, yeah.
support, then he
Yeah.
goes and, kills the rest of Gideon's like biological sons.
Except
Well,
for one.
except for
There's
one, yep.
one that he misses, and it's Jotham. Was that his
Mhm.
name? Correct. And Jotham there in verses, 7 through 21 is when Jotham addresses Abimelech. And basically what Jotham's response is to Abimelech doing all of this is basically, I hope that you and all of the people that have followed you turn against one another and destroy each other. That's basically what he's saying.
Mm-hmm.
Which is actually, if you keep reading, that's exactly what happens. And, that's not uncommon. That's a fairly common experience. Some man tries to force his way into power, and then all of those that were supporting him along his way, whenever he gets to that position of power, will inevitably turn against him and try to seize that power for themselves.
And in Shechem's case, just essentially he's saying that you're about to live in the bed you made, essentially.
Yep. Anything else there with chapter 9? Did you have something?
Just that Abimelech, this was only a kind of an ordeal for a span of 3 years. It seems
Yeah.
like it's a lot
Yeah,
longer, just
yeah.
like how much
It's a very
detail
long chapter, yeah.
it's given. And then you had another guy named Gale, I assume is how you pronounce that challenges Abimelech. And then Abimelech and his man kind of wait around for this guy. And Gale then, after he had kind of like talked a bunch of smack, then like when it's actually time to go out and like, having a legitimate battle, he's like kind of making excuses and kind of like stalling and stuff. And he's trying to kind of like outsmart Abimelech and try to like trap him or trick him. But he kind of stops his criticism, and then he's defeated at Shechem. But then eventually Abimelech is defeated and him and Shechem are pretty much completely wiped out.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Abimelech sets Shechem's like stronghold on fire. The people that are kind of like running away from him. In all this, like you kind of mentioned, a lot of like the internal chaos that they were going to face, but eventually he sets it all on fire and tries to do the same thing in another town that I'm probably going to mispronounce called Thebes or Thebes.
Close enough.
This is probably one of my favorite things that I read here, though. There was an old lady that dropped, or I guess it was an old lady, but a lady like dropped this big millstone from the tower, and it landed on his head, and it would have killed Abimelech. So he had one of his like his guards or his guys just like kill him, so that specifically it says this just so that he wouldn't go down as being killed by a woman. Can't go out like that.
Yeah. Anything else on chapter 9? Y'all want to do chapter 2 and then stop there for this episode? Or chapter 10, excuse me.
Oh,
chapter
backwards. 10. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
So chapter 10, we read very briefly in verses 1 through 5 of 2 other judges. Collectively, I believe, if I did my math and if I am remembering my math correctly, they collectively reigned for 55, or not reigned, but judged for 55 years. Outside of that, we don't know a whole lot of information about them. We see that
I've got 45.
Oh, 45.
23, 22.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Sorry. See, I did not remember my math correctly. And so not a whole lot of information. In verse 4, we do see of Jair, which is what I was talking about earlier when I meant to say Jael, or however you pronounce her name. He had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys, and they had 30 cities called Havoth Jair to this day, which are in the land of Gilead. And so, I mean, it's kind of similar to Shamgar here. We don't have a whole lot about them.
Yep.
But then in the remainder part of the chapter, we do see that they revert back, as always, true to form. They revert back to idolatry, and so God sends, if you look at verse 7, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the Philistines and into the hands of the Ammonites. They crushed and oppressed the people of Israel that year. For 18 years, they oppressed all the people of Israel who were beyond the Jordan in the land of the Amorites, which is in Gilead. So the whole remainder of the chapter is, of course, describing that oppression. Verse 10, we see that the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, saying, "We have sinned against you because we have forsaken our God and have served the Baals." And the Lord said to the people of Israel, "Did I not save you from the Egyptians and from the Amorites, from the Ammonites and from the Philistines, the Sidonians also, and the Amalekites and the Moabites oppressed you, and you cried out to me, and I saved you out of their hand. Yet you have forsaken me and served other gods. Therefore I will save you no more. Go and cry out to the gods whom you have chosen. Let them save you in the time of your distress." So we kind of see God, he's getting a little fed up with them, I guess you could say. The people of Israel said to the Lord, "We have sinned. Do to us whatever seems good to you. Only please deliver us this day." So they put away the foreign gods from among them and served the Lord, and he became impatient over the misery of Israel. And the Ammonites were called to arms, and they encamped in Gilead. And the people of Israel came together, and they encamped at Mizpah. And the people, the leaders of Gilead, said to one another, "Who is the man who will fight against the Ammonites? He shall be head over all the inhabitants of Gilead." Now that kind of leads into chapters 11 and 12, which deal with Jephthah, who is the judge that God raises up to deliver them this time. Y'all have anything else?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Pretty good summary.
I guess we will stop here. We'll pick up with Jephthah and his vow. How many pages and commentaries have been discussed
Written about
whether or not
that.
he actually kept his
Kept it,
vow or
yeah.
not.
Or if it was figurative.
Yeah. But we won't get into all of that next week because
Bird's eye view.
yeah, bird's eye view, as we say, and then we go for 58 minutes.
59.
Oh, 59.
Just
Okay.
rolled over.
Okay. As always, if you guys ever have any comments, questions, or topic suggestions, feel free to reach out to us at the conclusion of the matter at yahoo.com. You can message us on Facebook. You can text us personally or talk to us personally if you see us at worship on Sunday or Bible class on Wednesdays or any other time
Or send us
that you
some
may
fan
see
mail.
us. Yeah, or send us some fan mail.
Yeah.
That was very nice, very encouraging. Y'all have anything? Okay, well, for Judges, we can say that for now, this is the conclusion of the matter.